I'm delighted to introduce our moderator for the first panel, Petya Nestorova, who has been responsible for the Council of Europe's activities in the area of combating trafficking in human beings since 2010. She oversees all aspects of the monitoring of the Council of Europe Convention on Action Against Trafficking in Human Beings, including country visits, preparation of reports and recommendations, and the follow-up on the implementation. Ms. Nestorova holds master's degrees in international economic relations and comparative European studies, as well as a doctorate in philosophy from the University of Sussex, United Kingdom. I will also say that she is a longtime partner and collaborator with the OSCE, and we're delighted to have her moderate this panel. Petya, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Val. Good afternoon, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. The provision of assistance to trafficked persons, regardless of their willingness or ability to participate in the criminal justice process, is a litmus test of the commitment of states to follow a human rights-based approach to action against trafficking in human beings. This approach, as proclaimed by the United Nations recommended principles and guidelines for human rights and human trafficking, puts the human rights of trafficked persons right at the center of all efforts to prevent and combat trafficking in human beings. Victims who manage to break free of their traffickers' control are generally in a position of great vulnerability and insecurity. In addition to having suffered psychological trauma and physical injury, they are often in an irregular migration situation, without documents or resources to travel back to their countries of origin, and also in fear of retaliation against themselves and their families. Unless victims of trafficking are treated in a manner entitling them to protection and assistance, it would be impossible to remove them from the traffickers, to restore their violated rights and dignity, and to reintegrate them into society. The OSCE political commitments as set out in the 2003 Action Plan to combat trafficking in persons, and in particular in its 2013 addendum, emphasized the state should provide assistance to victims before the launch of an investigation, and that this assistance should not be conditional on the victim's willingness to participate in legal proceedings. The 2005 Council of Europe Convention on Action Against Trafficking in Human Beings, which has been ratified by 47 of the 47 out of the 57 participating OSCE participating states, contains a provision, which is Article 12, paragraph 6, requiring state parties to adopt legislative or other measures to ensure that assistance to victims is not made conditional on their willingness to act as witnesses. The Council of Europe Group of Experts on Action Against Trafficking in Human Beings, GRETA, which monitors the implementation of the Council of Europe Anti-Trafficking Convention, pays particular attention to any preconditions for a person to be considered as a victim of trafficking, such as to have agreed to cooperate in the investigation, or to have evidence, to be able to provide evidence of having suffered any damage. A definition of victim of trafficking which is too narrow risks leaving out of the scope of the protection mechanism of the convention persons who should benefit from protection and assistance. Victim protection requires, in the first place, steps to secure that all victims are properly and timely identified, irrespective of their resident status. The Council of Europe Group of Experts, GRETA, has stressed that the victim-centered approach of the Convention can be met only through multi-agency cooperation, such as in the framework of a national referral mechanism, involving a series of governmental and non-governmental actors, working together in a coordinated way to ensure that all victims, regardless of how they were first detected, have access to assistance and that their needs are effectively met. Timely and effective support to trafficked persons is important to ensure that their recovery and reintegration, and also to encourage them to break away from the traffickers. Delays or limitations on delivering assistance make victims vulnerable to further trafficking and abuse. The provision of timely assistance is also essential for encouraging victims to remain in the country of destination for long enough to serve as witnesses in trials against traffickers, if they so wish, as well as to claim and receive compensation. Measures to improve victim support should include consultation of survivors of human trafficking to ensure that their needs are adequately met. GRETA's monitoring work shows that there are continuing gaps in the availability of assistance measures, which are not dependent on the criminal justice process and adapted to the needs of victims. Even though, according to GRETA's monitoring observations, the number of countries where this link is being made has decreased over the years. For example, in 2014, 57 of the then parties to the Council of Europe Convention were urged by GRETA to ensure that access to assistance for victims of trafficking was not made conditional on their cooperation in the criminal justice process. 5 years later, in 2019, this proportion had fallen to 24%. In most parties to the Council of Europe Convention, admission to the victim assistance system is not dependent on the opening of a criminal investigation for a human trafficking offense, at least in law, if not always in practice. In some countries, even though the link does not exist formally, the provision of assistance to victims of trafficking hinges on their cooperation with law enforcement authorities. In other countries, access to the state-funded assistance programs is dependent on the qualification of the case as human trafficking. And if this is not the case, the victim can only receive assistance if an NGO can fund it from other sources, such as projects. GRETA has also raised the fact that in some countries, the issuing of temporary residence permits to trafficking victims, which is made conditional on their cooperation in the criminal justice process, erodes the standard of unconditional assistance, as well as is detrimental to the prevention of further trafficking. In November 2021, last year, the OSCE and the Council of Europe co-organized for the 4th consecutive time a meeting of national anti-trafficking coordinators and rapporteurs who discussed, amongst other things, the development of mechanisms for providing assistance for victims of trafficking, irrespective of their readiness to cooperate in the criminal justice process. We heard national examples from Greece, Ukraine, Serbia, and Poland, highlighting the benefits of the so-called social path for the identification and assistance of victims of trafficking. Participants in the meeting reconfirmed the benefits of not making victim identification and the provision of assistance dependent on the criminal justice process, including for the prevention of secondary victimization and the chances of success of the criminal justice process. And they also stressed the need for an appropriate legal basis and adequate human and financial resources. The focus of this 22nd Alliance Conference on unconditional protection and assistance of all victims of trafficking provides a high-level forum for advocating for full and effective implementation of international legal standards and political commitments. The first panel of the conference on building effective protection systems includes presentations highlighting good practices, remaining gaps, and opportunities for improvement. And I would like to start by introducing the first speaker on this panel, Mr. Kevin Hyland. Kevin has long 30-year experience in policing in the United Kingdom before becoming in 2014 the first United Kingdom's independent anti-slavery commissioner. He served with distinction until 2018. As a police officer, Kevin has led hundreds of human trafficking investigations, achieving unprecedented numbers of convictions in the UK and internationally. He was the author of the Strategic Development Goal 8.7 and led efforts for its inclusion for the eradication of human trafficking within the UN 12-year global goals. Since 2018, Kevin has been a member of the Council of Europe group of experts on action against trafficking, GRETA. He was also instrumental in the establishment and remains the chief advisor of the Santa Marta Group, which is a high-level partnership between law enforcement agencies, faith groups, and civil society, launched by Pope Francis at the Vatican in 2014. Kevin is the recipient of numerous awards, including for bravery and investigating serious organized crime, and also at the UN level for his work in human rights and equality. And he was also awarded the Officer of the Order of the British Empire in 2015. So Kevin, please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Petya, and thank you to the OSCE for organising this event. Your Excellency, ladies and gentlemen, human trafficking has been a global priority for over 20 years. The first international drive was at the UN with the Palermo Protocol in 2000. At the same time, the United States legislation, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, introduced many measures in the United States and included global awareness and influence through the annual Trafficking in Persons report with tier grading and potential sanctions for defaulters. Since that time, we have seen outcomes of efforts rise and fall. In recent years, prosecutions have fallen and impunity for perpetrators appear to have become greater. So what is the cost to the victims? And what can be done to change these trends to improve outcomes and responses? The Council of Europe Convention on Action Against Trafficking in Human Beings entered force on the 1st of February 2008. While building on existing international instruments, the Convention goes beyond the minimum standards agreed upon and strengthens the protection afforded to victims. The Convention has a comprehensive scope of application, encompassing all forms of trafficking, national and transnational, linked or not linked to organised crime, and taking in all persons who are victims of trafficking, men, women, or children. The Convention provides for a series of rights of victims of trafficking, in particular, the right to be identified as a victim, to be protected and assisted, to be given a recovery and reflection period, legal representation, to be granted a renewable residence permit, to receive compensation for the damages suffered, and introducing a non-punishment principle. Yet despite this and the many international and national commitments, action plans and policies that are proposed to address human trafficking are all too often reframed, diluted, or even ignore recognized best practice developed from years of experience, and importantly, the voices of those who have been exploited. Trafficking has three distinct elements that I will mention: the victim, the role of the state, and the perpetrator. The reason I place the victim at the head of this list is if responses are not designed to proactively identify victims, deliver long-term support, and build means to prevent exploitation, then the perpetrators will be gifted impunity. The suffering will continue, and the ill-gotten gains, believed to exceed over 150 billion US dollars per year, will continue and will increase. Understanding where and how someone might become a victim is crucial, as is how it happens, what can be done to prevent it, how proactive identification can be achieved, who has a responsibility for identification, and what the response is when a potential victim is identified. These are all elements necessary for an effective national referral mechanism, but frustratingly, these measures still elude many national responses. Whilst there is a much needed focus on supply chains and efforts should continue to look at root causes, these efforts should place more emphasis on reparation and provisions of support funded by those who profit, not just preparations of statements of intent. However, this should never distract the need for a national referral mechanism to be established by governments, meeting international standards of best practice, building responses that provide safety, support, stability, and long-term security. The question is what a proactive system of identification is. The aim of the Palermo Protocol and the Council of Europe Convention is to suppress
and end human trafficking. Whilst this is an enormous challenge, measures must have to contribute to ending this crime, not just managing it or responding after exploitation is self-identified or accepted after a victim has gone through an arduous process to convince authorities that they were a victim, often taking months or even years to decide. As a former police officer, I shudder to think that in 2022, victims of one of the most serious abuses and exploitation have to negotiate different agencies and bodies to have their status confirmed. This in itself assists perpetrators, discourages victims from coming forward, and in my view, is a betrayal of protecting human rights. I've heard it said on many occasions that a so-called easy to access NRM system will attract misuse and migrants might use it as a means of remaining in a country. However, the opposite is true. A professional, well-resourced and effective national referral mechanism would identify those who are genuinely trafficked, the level and type of support they require, and use that information and data for prevention, or where agreed by an individual to mount a prosecution. There have been cases in countries, including the UK, where courts have ruled that investigations and prosecutions should not be reliant on a victim. This is another element contained in the Council of Europe Convention. To be effective, an NRM must be integrated into states' responses and include all relevant actors, including civil society. But importantly, the state must ensure its vast reach and resources are designed to proactively identify victims, to provide unconditional access to support, and develop plans and strategies that place trafficking at the core of its business as usual. The new OSCE ODIHR guidance, launched earlier this year, was commended by US Congress Representative Chris Smith, the lead for the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, as the best so far. This gives guidance and clarity of what an NRM should look like, and importantly, what it should do, and the need for a trauma-informed systemic approach. The role of state actors, including from health, children's services, police, prosecutors, judiciary, local authorities, places of detention, border protection and immigration services, and more, need to have policies that are proactive in identifying potential victims, the places where victims are exploited, harbored, recruited, or transported. Crucial to these policies is that safety and support is not conditional to assisting the state. I've personally seen a case where a child was imprisoned as an adult for documenting offences, yet she was obviously a girl of only 14. The entire system actively looked the other way to her trafficking and her multiple rapes. Or where a woman was imprisoned for cultivating cannabis of over 1 million, despite discussions in the court that she was trafficked and forced into watering and minding the contraband at great risk to her health, and whilst in fear, nobody took any action. The failures in these cases not only led to a miscarriage of justice, but allowed organised trafficking criminals the impunity that I spoke of earlier. The purpose of a national referral mechanism needs to be better and properly understood. It should be open to different pathways bespoke to an individual's needs. In some cases, that might be high levels of support and access to residency. In others, a victim might want or need few forms of support. On occasions, I have met victims who do not want any support, but want to see their exploiters prosecuted. So an NRM should be flexible to respond to the different needs and situations. The world has committed to 17 global targets, the Sustainable Development Goals, including the eradication of human trafficking and child labour. as part of a state's delivery to achieving this, an effective, proactive national referral mechanism in each state is crucial. There is a great deal of speculation, research, consternation, and prevarication on how to address human trafficking. Introducing a state-led NRM is a basic and proven formula to addressing and ending this crime, and one all states should place as a national priority. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kevin, for highlighting the importance of each country having a national referral mechanism which is professional, well-resourced and flexible enough to cover different situations of victims of trafficking for different forms of exploitation. The onus of identification should not be on the victim, it is on the state to proactively identify victims and to involve, as you said, all relevant actors, state and non-state. We still see, at least in the 47, 48 now parties to the Council of Europe Convention with recently the accession of Israel, we see that not all of the state parties to the Council of Europe Convention have national referral mechanisms. And the recent OEC ODIHR updated NRM handbook, I think, is an excellent tool which should be brought to the attention of all states and really put into practice. With this, I would like to pass to the next speaker on this panel, Dr. Venla Roth. Venla has served as Finland's National Anti-Trafficking Coordinator since 2020. And before that, she has a long experience in the field of anti-trafficking action, both nationally and internationally. She was working previously as an anti-trafficking expert and head of the unit of the Office of the Finnish Non-Discrimination Ombudsman, and has also worked on various research and development projects. For example, for the European Parliament Research Services, the European Commission, and the European Institute for Gender Equality. Venla was also a member of the European Commission's expert group on action against human trafficking and the NRM advisory group established by OEC ODIHR. Venla holds a master's degree and a PhD in law, and you have the floor, Venla.
Thank you for giving me the floor. It's a great opportunity to be here today. Thank you for the invite to speak here, and thank you, Val, for organizing such an interesting and important event. Distinguished delegates, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to talk about today about the unconditional assistance of trafficking victims, Finnish lessons learned, and a way forward. So I'm trying to tell you something what we have learned during these years and how we have ended up in this situation where we are now and what are we going to do next. So besides the general social welfare and healthcare services, victims of human trafficking in Finland are entitled to specialized assistance and protection under the Finnish law. So this means that if the range of healthcare and social services provided for victims of human trafficking by the municipality are not sufficient for the needs of the victims of human trafficking, we have special assistance system. The services can, for example, in that case, be bought from the private sector or civil society, and the municipality may charge the costs from the state. So we think that ultimately it is the state that is responsible for the victim assistance. This specialized assistance is coordinated by a national assistance system for victims of human trafficking, which is a state-run and state-funded public authority. It assists victims, provides advice, information, training, and so on and so forth. And the number of clients in the assistance system has increased every year. Well, The thing is that in principle, the threshold to be admitted that this system is low, but in practice, there are conditions. These conditions relate to the initiation, continuation, and termination of the investigation and criminal proceedings. Well, we wanted to have a look at how this system works, and we actually commissioned a national rapporteur, which is an independent public authority reporting directly to the Parliament, a study on specialized service and how it works. The study was thus concluded that there are people in Finland who, in spite of their need for assistance, do not get sufficient assistance. And this is especially problematic, the situation for those victims of human trafficking who have been sexually abused in Finland. They just don't look specialized assistance in Finland. So they do not come under the radar of the Finnish authorities. Whether they get services at all remained unclear. And what was very clear under this study was that the central reason for not seeking assistance and looking for help and reporting the exploitation to the authorities was the strong link between the provision of specialized assistance and the process of bringing perpetrators to justice. So in practice, this assistance which was provided for victims of human trafficking was not unconditional. So the data indicated clearly that the victim's right to specialized assistance comes to an end if the criminal investigation process related to human trafficking was terminated, no charges were brought for human trafficking, or there was no verdict for human trafficking. This was considered in the study problematic from the perspective of detecting human trafficking and protecting victims' rights. So what was actually indicated was that because of the fact that victims of human trafficking do not have a courage to come forward, we authorities never come to know whether there is trafficking or not in Finland. The study reminded that rather than expressing a direct opinion on whether or not there was an offense, and especially a human trafficking offense, actually the criminal investigation authorities, they are interested in completely other thing. So they have a usually opinion that whether they have evidence on the offense. So whether there is evidence on trafficking available. And there might be many reasons why this evidence is not there and is lacking. So this lack of evidence may be because the defendant cannot be heard, or there are no witnesses in the case, or the witnesses cannot be identified. There's little documentary evidence, or the events have taken place for so long ago that they, it is practically impossible to prove, or other reasons. Anyways, it was not possible for the criminal practitioners in the criminal process to actually go forward. Well, what happened was that the national rapporteur reported to the Parliament, because this is what they are supposed to do, and they included in the report the conclusions of the study together with legislative recommendations. And the report was discussed in a very thorough way in the different parliamentary committees, and experts were heard. And on the basis of these discussions, based on the report of an independent national rapporteur, the Parliament required the government to investigate how the link between the victim assistance and criminal proceedings could be weakened. The multi-party government program in 2019 contains various anti-trafficking measures, including this one. And now the working group has been established and the proposal for legislative amendments are foreseen by the end of this year. What I just wanted to say is that we wanted to have a look how the situation looks like. Why victims of human trafficking, especially those who have been sexually exploited in Finland, never come to the attention of the authorities, or very seldom come. We think that this is a problem. So it's a problem for the individual victims, and it's a problem for the society at large. What I also wanted to say is that in order to know about this, we need independent reporting mechanisms. At least we Finland think so. And we have very much, let's say that we have benefited a lot about that. What is also very important is that, somebody takes seriously what we, and the National Rapporteur and this research, what they have to say. So the politicians, they listen to us. And they actually formed a government which clearly took this seriously. They wanted us to do better and more. What we also wanted to, and what we also saw was that, yes, exactly, this is a problem of detection. We always say that we don't know about trafficking. Trafficking is a hidden crime. But we also have to understand that it is hidden because victims are afraid. They're very much afraid of us, also the authorities, because they are afraid of becoming deported from the country, or they are afraid of the criminals. So it is very good for the society at large that we know what is going on in the country, and we need victims to do that, to say what is happening. We need their stories. And now what we are doing also is that we are including the issue of the right to reside in the country, because as Petya said, the chair said, this is not enough to talk about the victim assistance and criminal proceedings and their link, but it's also very important to talk about sustainable solutions. So in that sense, this is a very important topic. And what is going on now in Finland is that just in the late last year, October, we actually initiated a new residence permit for all victims of exploitation, not only victims of human trafficking. And what I wanted to say still, 1 month ago, the University of Helsinki published a study on the application of the penal provisions concerning human trafficking and related crimes. And I have to say that I wasn't very happy about the conclusions. The clear conclusions of the study was that victim assistance should not be conditional on criminal proceedings. And the reason for that was that the application of the criminal provision is very incoherent still also in Finland, unfortunately. So the question of what is human trafficking and what is not settled yet. And this is why it is very problematic to connect victim assistance to criminal proceedings. So this study also gives us very practical advice on how to proceed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Venla. Your conclusions are a really very important takeaway for all of us. Your 5 points are key messages from this conference, and what you have managed to achieve in Finland, thanks to having an independent national rapporteur with a strong mandate, and thanks to this evidence-based research that you've carried out, driving for legislative and policy changes, very important takeaway for everyone who is present here today. And last but not least, the importance of putting in the package the residence permit issue. With this, we'll continue with the next speaker who will build on these points, I'm sure, Suzanne Hoff, who is the international coordinator of Strada International, has been for many years now, since 2004. And for those who do not know, Strada International is a coalition or a network of anti-trafficking civil society organizations, 25 of them, with 5 associate members, and they're present in 24 countries across Europe. As part of her job, Suzanne manages a broad range of tasks, including strategy planning, lobby, advocacy, and representation of the Strada platform, next to coordination of European projects and research on the issue of human trafficking. Before working for Strada International, she worked for different NGOs such as Caritas Netherlands, the Dutch Center for International Cooperation, and the Dutch Refugee Council, as well as for the Amsterdam Mayor's Office and the International Department of the Amsterdam Municipality. So you have the floor, Suzanne.
Thank you very much, Petya, and thank you all for inviting me here today to speak on behalf of civil society. I'm very, very happy that this panel and the OSCE, as well as the Council of Europe and GRETA, are promoting now very strongly unconditional assistance to trafficked persons. Actually, we at Strada International have for long, and as Petya already said, we are a European NGO platform against trafficking in human beings and exist for 25 years. And from the start, we have been lobbying and advocating for a real human rights-based approach to ensure that victims of human trafficking can have access to protect and support, regardless of whether they have to cooperate with the authorities, and also regardless of whether they have a residence status in the country where they reside. Providing unconditional support to victims would be a recognition that fear of reprisal and the impact of trauma, as well as the fear of arrest, detention, and deportation, in case they have been staying irregularly in the country, may hinder their ability to engage with the criminal justice proceedings. Nevertheless, as just also mentioned earlier by Petya Nestorova, the chair of this panel, the access to support for victims of human trafficking in most European countries until today remains closely tied with the criminal justice system. And assistance and protection are still in practice made dependent upon reporting the crime and to victim participation in legal proceedings, as well as Venla also just mentioned, as well as the initiation of an investigation, continuation of a prosecution and or a successful prosecution of perpetrators, and also whether or not it's qualified as human trafficking. Even if victims are able and willing to make a complaint, to press charges, and to cooperate with the authorities, they risk of having no access to protection and support beyond the reflection and recovery period, just because a criminal procedure has not started, or because the procedure has been dismissed, or because the crime of human trafficking could not be proven, even though there are very clear indicators that the person has been severely exploited and abused. As a result, many victims can only receive assistance if civil society actors, and Petya mentioned this already, or others could provide them with support, while they have actually no access to compensation or remedy, regular declared employment and inclusion, and remain at risk of detention and deportation, or risk to be punished for crimes they have compelled to commit as a victim. This, already mentioned also by Petya before, this contradicts the provision of the European Anti-Trafficking Convention, Article 12, but also the EU Victim Rights Directive, Article 8 and 5, that provide for assistance and to be available from the earliest possible moment, irrespective of cooperation or whether the crime has been reported. The criminal justice framework harms the rights of trafficked persons and related vulnerable groups. And moreover, we see that the current scope is far too limited to deal with the issue of human trafficking, which is quite a complex issue. Furthermore, and it was also stressed already by the speakers, as long as there are no guarantees can be given that victim will receive assistance and a secure residence status when cooperating with the authorities, victims are not able and neither very much encouraged to cooperate. This is also visible in the low self-identification of trafficked persons at this moment. A real human rights-based approach will detach victims' identification and assistance from participation in criminal proceedings and places their interests at the core and the protection of their rights at the center and as the point of departure for any assistance and support. We also see that unconditional access to support can have a very positive impact on access to justice for victims of trafficking in relation not only to identification, as already mentioned by various speakers, but also to residence, compensation, non-punishment, and long-term integration, including victims' access to the labor market. Let me look at a few of those issues. Firstly, to guarantee the right to unconditional assistance, multiple stakeholders, including civil society actors and victim protection organizations, should be enabled to identify presumed victims based on agreed common indicators as part of the national referral mechanisms. This will increase the self-reporting of victims and thus also the identification of trafficked persons in general. In Austria, for example, the provision of assistance to presumed trafficked persons is provided by our member organization LEVE EBF, which is funded by the Austrian authorities, and this access to support and protection is free and unconditional. It begins before the start of any criminal proceeding, and it's not dependent on victims' willingness to act as a witness in a trial. Assistance is here available both to presumed victims identified by the police and to presumed trafficked persons who seek assistance or who are referred by other actors, including civil society actors. However, in the case of Austria, an obstacle remains that third country national victims still remain without a secure residence. Generally, we see all over Europe that resident permits are usually only granted for the period beyond the recovery and reflection period on the condition that human trafficking is reported to the police and the criminal investigation against the perpetrator is initiated and is still ongoing. In practice, it's very, very, very rare for victims of trafficking to be granted a long-term residence permit if they do not cooperate with the authorities or if a criminal case is discontinued. And there are only few possibilities at the moment to obtain residence on personal grounds, taking into account a range of situations, including also the victim's safety or vulnerability, the state of health, or the family situation of the victim. However, granting a residence permit on personal grounds would significantly increase victims' incentives to cooperate with the authorities. Moreover, if victims have no access to secure residence and remain in the country of destination as irregular persons, they have to take up precarious work again, undeclared work, in order to survive. When undocumented, people do not have any access to vocational training or to declared employment. And when persons can access a secure residence because of their personal situation and harm experienced, they can get access instead to legal aid, to trauma care, have access to employment and social protection, and also can work on their recovery, which reduces the chances for their re-victimization and re-trafficking, and will for sure support their social inclusion in the country. Kevin already mentioned the issue of compensation and the recovering of unpaid wages, and these are also crucial aspects of access to justice for victims of severe exploitation. Compensation, we all know, serves as an instrument of restorative justice and of prevention of further exploitation. It's also recognition again of the violation of the rights of victims, the damages they have suffered, or the wages they are still owed by their exploiters. But despite the international legislation in place, to which European countries in general very fully comply, a number of legal, procedural, financial, and also a lot of practical barriers remain which hinder the access of trafficked and exploited persons to effective remedies, including compensation. The situation is even exacerbated in the case of undocumented or irregular migrants who are disproportionately exposed to violence and exploitation because of the challenges they face in accessing justice and support. If victims are not able to cooperate with the authorities, they do not have access to free legal support, and it's extremely difficult for them to claim compensation via a criminal or civil court procedure due to the risk this would entail. We also see that these victims are often excluded from access to state compensation. If victims do not come forward, exploiters, we see, face much less risks for being investigated and prosecuted. It also reduces the possibilities for confiscation of assets or imposing of fines, and it increases the chance that exploitative practices continue. Lastly, the non-punishment principle. We see that the lack of the implementation of the non-punishment principle hinders the access of unconditional assistance for victims and their residents. Despite international and European legal binding standards on non-punishment and the adoption in many countries of specific legislation, trafficked persons in Europe are often still wrongly detained, prosecuted and punished for offences they have been compelled to commit in the course or as a result of having been trafficked. Our member organizations have also noted many cases in which victims were detained or prosecuted even though they were formally identified as trafficked persons and also recognized as such. Some of them are in detention for over a year. This is a very human rights violation and a denial of justice, and it serves to reinforce distrust towards the criminal justice system, re-victimization. We all see that criminal records can have long life negative consequences on the enjoyment of rights for victims, including again the rights to residence, employment and social welfare. In many countries, see that too little efforts are made to lift those criminal and administrative fines and records of victims, in particular for those victims who were unjustified punished, and that they also don't get any remedy for those earlier confiscations. I therefore want to highlight a couple of recommendations and close my presentation. We believe that victims of human trafficking should be entitled to adequate assistance and support, regardless of the resident status and on the basis of clear indications of their victimhood and clear indications of the violations of their human rights, and not just on the basis of their cooperation with the authorities. Secondly, we call that more actors should be allowed to identify trafficked persons and grant them a victim status. Thirdly, we ask for more possibilities for unconditional support and to extend those possibilities to ensure that victims can have an access to unconditional support. There was a very good example in the Netherlands, but unfortunately it stopped. It was a pilot which looked at the plausibility of victims for their victimhood, and if they were then identified as most likely a victim, they could still access victim support. We also call for safe reporting policies and effective complaint mechanisms, because we see in many European countries, victims who are irregular and undocumented can still not safely report a crime and complain to the police because they risk, again, detention, deportation. Also, we feel that access to legal aid should be increased, and barriers and criteria that limit the legal aid to victims should be lifted. And it should also be available for those who do not want to cooperate with the authorities. As said already, we also want trafficked persons to have access to residence on personal grounds, and this should be extended to all European countries. We also feel that public prosecutors should assume that suspected or accused persons or victims of trafficking, they should ensure that if they think that this person might be a victim, they should establish contacts with specialized centers in order to provide for professional support and counseling. And lastly, I think there should be more access to remedies, including compensation and back wages for those not able to cooperate with the authorities. I would like to conclude by quoting Valiant Ricci. He said it already in the announcement of this conference. It's time that we grant victims their rights. It's time to give victims the support they need, and it's time to listen to victims. And Petya, if I may, I would like to just announce one more thing. Tomorrow at 9:30, we organize together with the Council of Europe, we organize a side event to this conference on access to residence. And you can find it in the side event program. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Suzanne, for this full circle that you made of victims' rights, not just to assistance, but all the related rights that you mentioned, including remedies such as compensation and back wages, and the important non-punishment provision. In fact, all of these rights are included in the legal obligations of state parties to the Council of Europe Convention, which I remember some years ago someone referred to as the Magna Carta of the rights of trafficked persons, with all the rights which are there, and the implementation is of course being monitored, but still we see a lot of gaps remaining, and it is not really down to civil society to be filling these gaps when the state obligations to fulfill these rights. And of course, the side event that you mentioned, which we're organizing together on unconditional assistance and the link to residence tomorrow morning. And now I would like to introduce the final speaker on this first panel of the 22nd Alliance Conference. And it's my great pleasure to introduce Dina Dominitz. Dina has been the National Anti-Trafficking Coordinator and head of the Anti-Trafficking Unit of the Ministry of Justice of Israel since 2016. She is also heading two ministerial committees, one on the implementation of the governmental resolution on aid and protection of persons in prostitution and legislations prohibiting consumption of prostitution. It's a new provision, I understand, in Israel. And the second committee is on the implementation of the government resolution to combat negative effects of polygamy, particularly of women and children. Prior to this, Dina worked as a senior deputy to the Attorney General, as well as a senior director of the legal department of the Israeli Ministry of the Interior. And she holds a LLB and LLM in law from Bar Ilan University. You have the floor, Dina.
Thank you so much, Petya, and the OSCE and all the team for the organization. It's a great honor for me to take part in this high alliance and share Israel's experience, efforts, best practices, and insights on this important topic of the protection of victims and upholding of their rights. Out of the 3 or 4 Ps in the protocol, Israel is most proud. Yep, the clicker. Now it works. Israel is most proud of the protection model, which is victim-centered and trauma-informed, and that established care frameworks for victims that are state-funded. And I will describe them today. And I will also elaborate on the changes to the protection model and the identification mechanism process that Israel is currently in the midst of, according to our new national plan. And the aim is to create a better division and detachment between the assistance and the rights of the victims to the victim's participation or ability even to participate in the criminal proceedings. And also to encourage an identification and an individual needs-based approach aimed at reintegration into society in a holistic and flexible manner that takes into account the survivor's wishes, their views, their dreams, and the changing patterns of human trafficking in all its ugly forms. So this is the existing model of the protection policy of trafficking in persons victims in Israel today, which is comprised of state-funded frameworks for TIP victims that, as you see, are funded by the Ministry of Welfare and Social Services. And the victims are entitled to special rights and aid mechanisms that I will elaborate shortly on. We also, according to our new national plan that I mentioned, we have a designated work team that is in charge of the protection, and it is leading the reform and the change of the model that we will describe. Okay, so the rights of the victims can be categorized into different groups. We have rights within the criminal procedures, which of course address those victims who have agreed to participate in the criminal proceedings. In Israel, it has always been non-conditional, but as I mentioned, we are trying to even enhance that and detach it even further. We uphold the non-punishment principle. We allow and encourage early testimony as to allow victims who wish to return to their countries of origin to do so. And we also have special procedures that set out special protections of the victims within the criminal proceedings, such as the ability to testify not in front of the defendant, either by VC or behind a curtain, and many other procedures that protect their privacy and the dignity of the witnesses within this trial. Another branch of victims' rights is the compensation that has been mentioned today. The court, according to law, must compensate the victim as part of the sentence within the criminal proceedings, and also all the property and the profits that were seized from the traffickers are then diverted into a special forfeiture fund, which is then reallocated, and I will also give a few more details about that shortly. Victims are all entitled to rehabilitation and therapy. All victims are entitled to a year of rehabilitation in the shelters that I mentioned, and within the shelters they are also receiving any healthcare, psychological, psychiatric and social care that they need free of charge. They're also given vocational trainings and education, different courses to prepare them better to reintegration into society. Rehabilitation through employment, we see that also as a very important branch, so that victims are entitled to special residence and work visas, access to employment. Those victims who do choose to give testimony and are able to give testimony and cooperate with the enforcement authorities are entitled to the stay in the shelters and all the rights that I've mentioned that accompany that throughout the criminal proceedings. And once the criminal proceedings are finally completed, they are then allowed for another further year of rehabilitation in the shelters, so that they do receive a certain advantage. And we do want to encourage, of course, victims to participate and to cooperate in the criminal proceedings, but it is non-conditional, so that any victim is entitled to a year of rehabilitation with all the rights that are included. And at the end of this year, we also assist in safe return, which is of course voluntary and not forced, and they are given a special grant of money to return with. We also try to contact the welfare authorities of their state of origins in order to continue and complete the rehabilitation that they have started while in Israel. And this is of course dependent on their agreement to do so. Yeah, so here we can just see a little bit of data about the Forfeiture Fund, which I think is a very interesting and innovative protective mechanism. It started its operations in 2016, and for example in 2021 we convene once annually. So in 2021 we allocated nearly $1 million shekels, which is equivalent to around $350,000. Most of the funds go to victims of trafficking who can apply to the fund and request allocation of compensation, whether it's for monies that couldn't be collected from the traffickers according to court-ordered compensation, or it could be for very diverse causes: housing, dental treatment, psychiatric help, even studies in university, driving lessons, many causes that we have funded from this. And NGOs, of course, can also apply and receive funding for various projects assisting combating trafficking. We'll continue. Another mechanism that I wanted to just highlight very briefly is the Child Online Protection Bureau. It's been mentioned a few times today that the cyber arena is one that we definitely need to be looking at more, and particularly children are exposed to abuse and offensive behaviors on the web. So Israel has established a special protection bureau, which is a national hotline that deals with complaints that children themselves can call this hotline. And there are awareness campaigns that especially aimed at children to encourage them to call. But of course, any adult as well can call and report offensive behavior against children committed in the online realm. The calls are received by trained police officers and by social workers. And as you can see, in 2021, the hotline handled nearly 12,000 events, out of which 22 of them were sexually exploitation related. And the main platforms that were reported for abuse were Instagram and WhatsApp, which are of course the main most popular used by minors. So this is our model today. These are the frameworks that are existing. We call it the one size fits all model, because basically if you are recognized as a victim, and we will currently just elaborate on how this happens, you are then referred. This basically opens the keys, the doors to the protection frameworks, and you are referred to the shelters. We have one shelter for men and we have a shelter for women. They are both state funded. In 2021, as you can see, there were 47 women who resided in the shelters, mainly from Eastern Europe countries, and there were 42 men in the male shelters, mainly victims of labor and slavery, and mostly from Africa and the Far East. We have also apartments, which are family apartments, which are basically women with their children. In 2021, we had 7 women in these apartments with 17 children, most of them from Eritrea, Ethiopia, and Sudan. And we also have a day center, which is mainly aimed at those victims who do not choose to reside in the shelters, who refuse to be in the shelters, but are still in need of protection. And also for those victims who have finished their stay in the shelters, but then are not able to return to their home countries for various reasons. So they are able to continue receiving services in the day center, which in 2021 catered to the needs of 99 women and 113 men. So, as I mentioned, we are in the midst of changing our model, and we're basically going from this one-size model that I described to a one-stop shop. And the reason that we are doing this is also because of the new patterns that we are seeing evolving and the new characterizations of victims. And the wish that we have is to create a holistic and flexible and individually based range of protective services that are trauma-informed and gender-sensitive, and that detach exactly what we were talking about between the cooperation with the enforcement authorities and the need for protection and assistance. So in this new model, basically the shelters will still be the first stop once the victim is recognized and referred to the shelter. They will still be referred to the shelters at the initial stage. But the shelters will be, the stay in the shelters will be much shorter, from about 3 to 6 months in the maximum. And this is in order to assess the victim's situation and condition. And first of all, to remove the victim from danger and threat. This is the first stage. And while they are staying in the shelter in this first initial period, there will be an assessment by a case manager, a social worker, and she will build a personal and individual program that will be based on the victim's needs and his wishes, so that most victims will be able to leave the shelters after this short period of time and then live in the community, assisted by their individual rehabilitative program in the community, which will be served by the day center, which will basically be this one-stop shop. Everything will happen in this day center. They will receive all the services there. The police will do the investigations there, which will be a more friendly place than taking them to the police station. There will be a special room for legal consultations with the legal aid. There will be, and the prosecution will be able to prepare the witnesses for trial in a special room in the day center. There will be a doctor's clinic in the day center that victims will be able to make appointments to and receive healthcare and referrals also to hospitals if needed. There will be special rooms for group therapy, therapy by arts, sports center, and many other opportunities. All the rights that I mentioned before will continue to be given to the victims, including the work visas, of course, and the employment and access to employment. But we feel that the idea is that the survivors will be empowered and their independence will be encouraged, and also the reintegration into society, as opposed to the system that we have today, which basically removes the survivors and the victims from the public eye, puts them into institutions which are 24/7 supervised. And when we're talking about grown-ups, this is something that is very difficult for a person to do, to suddenly live in a room with other women from all different countries. Sometimes we talk about the shelters as the Tower of Babylon, because there are so many different languages spoken there, and people from so many different countries who are suddenly living together and sharing a bathroom and eating the food that is prepared in the shelters. And they don't get to choose when they can leave. They don't get to choose when to eat or when to sleep or when to go out to work. And this is something that the state has realized that it causes even a detrimental effect on the victims. And this is the reason that we have decided to move to this model. And we're very hopeful that it will prove itself as a good model and something that could be perhaps adopted in other countries. Also in the field of legal aid, we're also expanding the legal aid in the new model. Today, the legal aid represents pro bono in civil procedures, and also matters to do with legal status in Israel, can represent all trafficking victims, and even those that have not been recognized, but there is a prima facie evidence that they are victims. Of course, the victims are exempted from the economic eligibility test, and there is independent discretion. You can see that in 2021, 135 victims of trafficking received legal aid, which is actually a big rise from 2020, in which there were around 80 victims who received legal aid. And we can see that it's really important and crucial. You can see the different kinds of victims, both the prostitution and sexual abuse victims, slavery and forced labor, 28 victims of the Sinai camps, and 24 victims from abusive cults. These are Israelis, mostly Israeli citizens who fall prey to abusive cults, holding them in slavery within Israel. So according to the new model, we have passed a new legislation that has been passed by government, but it is awaiting still authorization by the Knesset, by the parliament. So it's in process of passing. And according to this new model, the expansion of the legal aid will be also to the criminal proceedings against the traffickers. So basically, we're talking about a model in which the legal aid will accompany the victim from the first initial stage of recognition, of identification, throughout the investigation, and also then the criminal proceedings if an indictment is passed down. And the legal aid will make sure that their rights and compensation is exhausted within the proceedings, and that they are representing the rights of the victim also at this stage, and also even in the identification model. So yeah, I'm on. Okay, so just a word again also about the changing victim recognition mechanism. In order to better detach the protection and upholding the rights of victims from the cooperation with the criminal proceedings, we are also changing the model of recognition. Instead of today, the police are the sole authority who recognize victims. So that even though we say that it's non-conditional, but once you have the police as the authority who decide who is a victim and who is also entitled, of course, to the rights and protection, then victims, of course, feel less comfortable approaching the police, and it also creates a feeling that they perhaps need to cooperate, even though they are told that it is not non-conditional. So the idea is that we separate between that. The authority will be passed basically to me, to my unit, the National Anti-Trafficking Coordination Unit in the Ministry of Justice. But we will also establish an advisory committee. In this committee, we will have the police and other governmental representatives, but we also have two trafficking survivors, one of whom works in my office. I think Jennifer mentioned today the importance of including survivors in the decision-making and policy-making processes. So this is a first step for us, and he will be on this committee as well as other survivors. and we also have NGO representatives. And we hope that this will also increase more proactive identification and a more holistic approach, but also assist in the non-conditional approach that we are talking about. So my last slide is just to mention, as many people have mentioned today, the humanitarian crisis following the situation in the Ukraine. In Israel, as well as in other countries in Europe, we are seeing waves of refugees seeking refuge in Israel. And we are seeing a rise also in the attempts of traffickers to bring in victims of trafficking into Israel for mainly for prostitution, and also efforts to solicit and to tempt women, mainly the women and children who have arrived in Israel, into prostitution and sexual exploitation. So we have been preparing flyers. This is you can see a picture here on the board. This was funded by the Ministry of Justice, and big signs, roll-ups that are at the airports and also at centers where the refugees are staying at after they enter Israel. And this is to warn them of the indicators and of the suggestions that they might receive from people and how to beware, and also to refer them to a state line, a hotline, which can assist them and to give them aid, and also refer them to us and to the police in order to protect them. I'll end with just one example of protection that something that the reality has created, and we might not have thought of it before, but one of our victims in the shelters, a woman is a Ukrainian citizen. She hadn't seen her daughter for a few years, as she was a witness and she testified, and then she's now in the middle of her rehabilitation year after the proceedings ended. Her daughter was left with a grandmother in the Ukraine, and once the hostilities broke out, the grandmother sent the daughter, a 12-year-old daughter, on her own out of the country, and basically the grandmother couldn't come with, so the daughter was left on her own. With quite a complex operation, we managed to bring the daughter to Israel to reunite with her mother, and we gave them a special apartment, one of the family apartments within the frameworks. This mother had not seen, the victim had not seen her daughter for 6 years. So this was one, very emotional and also example of to what limit the protection can arrive. So on that note, just, as a saying that we have in Israel, I'll end on that. It's an ancient saying that says, "He who saves one soul basically is saving the whole world." So if we all perhaps make one small step and try to save one person together, I think we could perhaps save the whole world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dina, for presenting Israel's system for the identification and assistance of trafficked persons, and the efforts that you're making to reform and improve it. They're really impressive how you're learning from doing things, and I think for all of us, the package that you presented looks really like an improvement on what you have done in the past. And finishing with your real life example and the really important work that Israel is now doing to receive and protect victims who arrive from Ukraine. Now on this, I will thank all the panelists, of all of you, for your really impressive and stimulating presentations, giving a lot of food for thought and good advice for all the participants at the conference. And as we have not that much time left, and 9 requests for statements from the floor. As you were told earlier, the maximum length of a statement is 2 minutes. So if everyone sticks to the 2 minutes, I think all 9 of you can just about manage by 5:30. And with this, I would like to give the floor to the first. This is the delegation of France, who will also speak on behalf of the European Union. France, you have the floor.
Merci Madame la Présidente. Avec votre permission, je passe la parole à la délégation de l'Union européenne.
Madam Moderator, since it's the first time that I take the floor, let me say that the European Union and its member states are very pleased to participate in the 22nd High-Level Alliance Against Trafficking in Persons Conference. We would also like to thank the OSCE Special Representative and Coordinator for Combating Trafficking in Human Beings for successfully organizing this conference. This conference is taking place against the backdrop of Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. We would be remiss not to mention the plight of the Ukrainian people and the hardships that they are facing during this unprecedented humanitarian crisis. Today, Europe is experiencing its biggest refugee crisis since the Second World War. Millions of Ukrainians have been forced to flee the country or have been internally displaced. Most of these fleeing violence are women and children requiring special protection and assistance. The theme of this year's Alliance Conference is thus highly relevant. In this context, the European Union welcomes the focus of the Alliance on protection, and we thank the speakers in the opening session, the keynote speakers, and the speakers of the first panel for their contributions, for highlighting the importance of the topic and for analyzing current protection efforts and identifying good practices and opportunities that can improve protection efforts. The European Union and its member states express the full solidarity with Ukraine, the people of Ukraine, and its democratically elected institutions in these dark hours. To date, the European Union and its member states have welcomed almost 4 million Ukrainians fleeing this war of aggression, providing them food, shelter, access to health services, education, and the labor market. We will continue to provide protection to those seeking shelter, and we will help those looking for a safe way home. We would also like to commend the Republic of Moldova for all their efforts. The humanitarian catastrophe on the ground inflicted by Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine requires urgent action. We demand that Russia immediately and unconditionally cease its military actions and withdraw all its troops from the entire territory of Ukraine. We support all efforts of the OSCE chair, of the OSCE executive structures and autonomous institutions in order to assist the people of Ukraine, including through the coordination and facilitation of humanitarian assistance and the support to safe pathways and humanitarian convoys. We would also like to take this opportunity to commend the work of the Office of the Special Representative for providing participating states with timely recommendations to mitigate the risks of human trafficking stemming from the flow of refugees coming from Ukraine. Indeed, these recommendations have proved useful in reinforcing protection and assistance to those fleeing the war in Ukraine. Madam Moderator, the EU Anti-Trafficking Directive requires member states to take the necessary measures to establish appropriate mechanisms aimed at early identification of, assistance to, and support for victims in cooperation with relevant support organizations. Moreover, member states shall take the necessary measures to ensure that assistance and support for a victim are not conditional on the victim's willingness to cooperate in criminal proceedings. In addition, the EU strategy on combating trafficking in human beings 2021 and 2025, the Commission undertook to support member states' efforts to improve the early identification of victims, as well as their referral to assistance, support and protection services, taking into account the special needs and the forms of exploitation to which they have been subjected. We now have a specific responsibility of ensuring that the national laws transposing EU Anti-Trafficking Directive are fully used to protect the most vulnerable persons fleeing Ukraine. Madam Moderator, we look forward to engaging in the discussions during this year's Alliance Conference and hope that they will provide us with the best practices and durable protection measures. I thank you.
Yes, I would like to thank the representative of France, also on behalf of the European Union. I'm not going to say anything by way of comment because we're running out of time, so please keep to the 2 minutes of time that the organizers mentioned at the beginning. The next statement is, has been requested by Egypt, and it will be via Zoom. You have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Moderator, and thank you to OSCE for the invitation and for enabling us to give us a brief aperture about the activities of Egypt in the question of protection of UOTs. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, Egypt has drawn special attention to combating the heinous crime of trafficking since 2007 through the establishment of the National Coordinating Committee for Combating and Preventing Illegal Migration and Trafficking in Person, NCCPIM and TIP, which I am proud to be its chairperson ever since, and which encompasses 30 members, including ministries, national human rights councils, and other concerned bodies. A legal framework has been put in place to act as a compass through which the committee was able to fulfill its duty. Law 64 of 2010. A study on the different forms of trafficking paved the way for the drafting of our national strategy 2016 and 2021, focusing on the 4 main pillars: prevention, prosecution, protection, and partnership. Acknowledging the importance of an effective protection system as a stepping stone toward the eradication of this phenomenon, Egypt has dedicated all efforts and resources to enhance its own national protection system, as well as to secure and ensure and prioritize the protection of victims at all stages, from their identification to their reintegration into society. On that basis, our Interministerial Committee worked on strengthening the effectiveness of the hotlines of 3 national human rights councils, which are deemed among the first responders to victims. This is besides building the capacity of the helpline personnel and providing the legal assistance to the victims. Furthermore, the committee, in cooperation with the Ministry of Social Solidarity and the Egyptian Red Crescent, inaugurated the first dedicated shelter for women and children victims of trafficking beside the existing ones. Additionally, intensive training programs have been set up for service providers operating at the shelters nationwide, including social workers, to introduce them to the national protection system for VOTs. Egypt made sure to constantly update its national referral mechanism in accordance with the international standards and best practices, which is the main steering wheel to ensure the protection of actual and potential victims. Under its umbrella, the NRM includes all concerned bodies, from the National Human Rights Council to the law enforcement bodies and ministries that provide protection and assistance services to the victims. Through the aforementioned efforts, the committee was able to enhance the national protection system to respond to all VOTs equally, either Egyptian or foreign victims. Among the achievements, the dedicated shelter has received VOTs who were identified by the frontliners. On the other hand, the hotlines of the National Human Rights Councils succeeded in identifying and referring more victims of trafficking, which indicates the effectiveness of the NRM as a significant tool. Egypt, through the Interministerial Committee, is working towards bolstering the main elements, yes, of its protection system for VOTs through widening the scope of the capacity building programs by targeting more first responders and service providers. The relevant awareness raising campaigns reach out a larger audience and deepen the areas of cooperation with national and international partners. To further proceed with the existing national efforts, the committee is currently preparing the new counter-trafficking strategy in cooperation with our stakeholders. The committee is also reviewing the successful international examples and best practices from various countries. As a result of the firmness and commitments of Egypt, the 2014 constitution explicitly prohibits all forms of trafficking in persons. On the other hand, President al-Sisi endorsed clear support to all activities for VOT's protection.
Excuse me, Madam
Moderator, to conclude, the COVID-19, I'm concluding, Madam. The COVID-19 pandemic, as well as the recent political and economic developments in the world, are clear evidence of how important international collective work is to share best practices on how to address the different common challenges, on top of which is trafficking. Thank you, Madam Moderator.
Thank you, Madam. I would like to once again stress that you should not speak for more than 2 minutes. It's difficult and not very polite for me to interrupt you, but I will have to, because this is what was announced at the beginning. And I would like to give the floor now to the representative of Liechtenstein.
Thank you, Madam Moderator, for the floor. Excellencies, dear colleagues, we commend the organizers for convening this year's alliance and thank the panelists for their insightful contributions. We condemn the Russian aggression against Ukraine in the strongest terms possible. The war has led to a catastrophic humanitarian situation and to enormous suffering of the civilian population. Millions have been forced to flee their homes. One of the consequences of the Russian aggression has been the increased vulnerability and risk of human trafficking. This challenge is even more severe since the vast majority of those who flee are women and children. The OSCE has an important role to play in preventing and combating human trafficking, not only in the OSCE region, but also in the context of the Ukrainian war. We would like to assure the Office of the Special Representative and Coordinator our full support. Part of our collective fight against human trafficking should include leveraging the role played by the financial sector in ending these crimes. This is why we have created the Liechtenstein Initiative on Finance Against Slavery and Trafficking, or FAST for short. FAST aims to engage the financial sector to tackle human trafficking and modern slavery. We invite all interested parties to join us in carrying out the objectives of FAST. FAST makes sure that we make financial inclusion and economic empowerment a major means to prevent vulnerability in the first place. Credit can prevent vulnerable people from falling into debt, bondage, or labor trafficking. In this regard, FAST is promoting financial access to help prevent and remedy human trafficking. We would also like to highlight that the three largest banks in Liechtenstein are providing refugees from Ukraine with fee-free accounts. Madam Moderator, eradicating human trafficking is an enormous challenge. There is no doubt that FAST is just one initiative in the global effort to reach this goal, but we are convinced that it is an indispensable part, and we are greatly encouraged by the responses we have received from all actors so far. Liechtenstein will keep working to change the way the financial sector engages with these issues in order to make a real difference in our global fight against human trafficking. I thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Representative Liechtenstein. The next statement has been requested by the delegation of Canada, and it will be via Zoom. You have the floor.
Merci. Excellences, distingués invités, chers collègues, permettez-moi tout d'abord de remercier l'OSCE d'avoir organisé ce toujours utile événement. J'adresse également mes remerciements à ma collègue, Madame Jennifer Richardson de la province de l'Ontario, qui a partagé son expertise unique et inestimable avec ce forum plus tôt dans la journée. Merci également aux panélistes pour leur présentation. Malheureusement, alors que nous semblons tous et toutes déterminés à éradiquer la traite de personnes, les circonstances actuelles ne font que nous éloigner de notre objectif. Après la pandémie de la COVID-19 qui a augmenté les risques dans le monde entier, nous sommes maintenant confrontés à une guerre injustifiable en Europe, qui exacerbe les chances que des femmes et des filles deviennent victimes de ces crimes dans cette région. Le Canada condamne fermement l'agression illégale et non provoquée de Vladimir Poutine contre l'Ukraine. En lançant cette guerre, la Russie viole la Charte des Nations Unies et s'attaque à la démocratie et au principe de la primauté du droit et du multilatéralisme que cette organisation s'est engagée à défendre et à renforcer. Chair, Canada is deeply concerned by the impact of the conflict on civilians and the unfolding humanitarian crisis. The resulting chaos and lawlessness contributes to an environment in which traffickers can thrive. We need to take action to prevent women and girls, who account for the majority of refugees fleeing the conflict, from becoming victims of trafficking in persons for the purpose of sexual exploitation or forced labor. Gender-responsive, victim-centered, trauma-informed, and age-appropriate identification techniques and protection services must be central to our collective efforts. To that end, collaboration with civil society and the private sector is essential. Canada stands with the government of Ukraine and its brave and resilient people and joins the international community in calling on the Russian leadership to end its inhumane war of choice against Ukraine and turn to good faith diplomacy. Thank you.
Thank you. The next statement will be made by the delegation of the Holy See, which is in the room. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. Madam Moderator, the delegation of the Holy See expresses its gratitude to the coordinator and the OSCE Special Representative for combating trafficking in human beings, as well as to all those who have contributed to the organization of this important conference, the keynote speakers and the panelists. We welcome this panel discussion on how to build effective protection systems. It is especially relevant in light of the continued impact of the COVID-19 pandemic and the consequences of the ongoing war in Ukraine, including the humanitarian crisis it has generated, both of which pose new challenges. In this regard, Pope Francis' special envoy, Cardinal Michael Czerny, while visiting Ukrainian refugees in Hungary and the Ukrainian town of Berehove, acknowledged the risk of Ukrainian refugees, especially women and children, being kidnapped and exploited. He noted that this is the perverse work of human traffickers and people seeking to enslave those so vulnerable by falsely offering them help and then trapping them. Therefore, in this tiring time, we must be even more vigilant. This year's conference theme, protection, upholding victims' rights, and strengthening assistance, takes a victim-centered perspective and complements the theme of Pope Francis' annual World Day of Prayer and Awareness against human trafficking, which focused on the power of care, women, the economy, and trafficking in persons. We look forward to sharing the insights gained from this conference throughout the following sessions. Given the time constraints, I will end here. The entire statement will be distributed. Thank you very much.
Thank you as well to respecting the allocated time. The next statement will be made on behalf of Italy, the Italian delegation, which is in the room. Please, you have the floor.
No, Madam Moderator, is the delegation online.
I'm sorry, online. You have the floor.
Grazie signor Presidente, cari colleghi. L'Italia si allinea pienamente all'intervento dell'Unione Europea e desidero aggiungere alcune osservazioni a titolo nazionale per la lotta al traffico degli esseri umani. Desideriamo innanzitutto ringraziare l'Ufficio del rappresentante speciale e coordinatore per l'organizzazione della conferenza e confermare il nostro sostegno alle attività dell'OSCE per il rafforzamento delle capacità nazionali degli Stati partecipanti nel contrasto al traffico di esseri umani, attraverso un approccio incentrato sulle vittime e nel pieno rispetto dei diritti umani. Siamo lieti di confermare il nostro sostegno ai progetti dell'Ufficio per promuovere ulteriormente l'adozione della metodologia OSCE, sviluppata nell'ambito degli esercizi di simulazione condotti in partenariato con il Centro di Eccellenza per le Unità di Polizia e di Stabilità, COESPU, dell'Arma dei Carabinieri italiana a Vicenza. A livello nazionale vogliamo segnalare che è in corso di definizione il nuovo piano nazionale d'azione contro la tratta e il grave sfruttamento degli esseri umani 2022-2025. Nel piano sarà confermata la governance del sistema su due livelli, nazionale e territoriale, basata su un modello multi-agenzia che favorisce la collaborazione dei vari soggetti pubblici e privati coinvolti. È fondamentale in questo quadro anche il rapporto con le parti sociali, le associazioni e gli enti del terzo settore che sono impegnati unitamente ai soggetti pubblici nell'attuazione dei progetti antitratta. L'attenzione sarà in particolare volta a prevedere misure per contrastare, oltre alle catene produttive illegali, anche i sistemi di approvvigionamento che, pur operando nella legalità, vendono servizi e prodotti a basso costo. Dette economie, infatti, offrono il fianco allo sviluppo di fenomeni criminali di grave sfruttamento, tratta e finanche riduzione in schiavitù. L'Italia è inoltre impegnata a superare alcune criticità del sistema giudiziario. Spesso infatti le azioni di contrasto al grave sfruttamento e alla tratta di esseri umani non sempre riescono a concludersi con sentenze di condanna degli autori dei reati per diversi fattori, a partire dalla scarsa conoscenza dei meccanismi di referral. In questo rinnovato assetto si opererà sempre di più per la tutela delle persone vulnerabili, ulteriormente rafforzati sotto il profilo dell'assistenza personale e materiale, così come prescrive la Convenzione di Varsavia. È stato da più volte e da più parti rimarcato che le misure di prevenzione e di promozione dei diritti umani delle vittime di tratta a cui fa riferimento la Convenzione di Varsavia non possono in alcun modo intaccare né il principio della libertà di autodeterminazione personale e sessuale, né il sistema di norme nazionali e internazionali che ne tutelano il loro esercizio. In tal senso, sia il sistema criminal penalistico che le norme del testo unico dell'immigrazione italiano rendono il sistema italiano un modello di buone prassi in ordine all'attenzione e al sostegno dedicato alle vittime di tratta, con una nota di merito ulteriore sul piano della tutela dei minori anche non accompagnati. Alla luce di quanto premesso si evidenzia fin d'ora la difficoltà di ipotizzare l'introduzione nel sistema giuridico italiano di misure punitive nei confronti dei fruitori, clienti dei servizi legati al mondo della prostituzione. Grazie a tutti per l'attenzione e per la preziosa opportunità offerta dal consesso.
Thank you very much. The next statement will be made by the Russian delegation, the Russian Federation's delegation, which is I believe in the room.
Спасибо, госпожа модератор. Мы не будем, в отличие от некоторых коллег, здесь сыпать политическими лозунгами. Выступим по делу. Российская Федерация приветствует ежегодное проведение конференций Альянса против торговли людьми на площадке ОБСЕ, отмечает усилия Офиса специального представителя и координатора, рассчитывает на конструктивный обмен мнениями. Торговля людьми представляет собой не только грубое нарушение прав гражданина, но и зачастую прямое посягательство на жизнь и здоровье человека. С сожалением констатируем, что это и одна из самых прибыльных форм транснациональной преступности. Несмотря на многочисленные усилия по противодействию трафикингу, от него по-прежнему страдают тысячи людей, которые из-за сложности борьбы с этим явлением не получают или вовремя не получают помощи, а организованные криминальные группировки уходят от наказаний. Самое пристальное внимание должно уделяться борьбе с первопричинами попадания людей в руки трафикеров, устранению или максимальному нивелированию факторов уязвимости. Чаще всего жертвами торговли людьми становятся дети, женщины, люди, попавшие в трудную жизненную ситуацию, беженцы и мигранты. А миграционная ситуация на пространстве ОБСЕ давно вызывает опасения. Мы с интересом ознакомились с рекомендациями, подготовленными на этот счет в начале марта Офисом спецпредставителя. И исходим из того, что в будущем к обсуждению практических мер в этой сфере будут привлекаться все заинтересованные государства-участники ОБСЕ. Значительным риском подвергаются дети-мигранты и беженцы, особенно разлученные с семьей. Они становятся легкой добычей для преступников как на пути в страну назначения, так и по прибытии. Недопустима ситуация, когда эти дети пропадают с радаров профильных органов власти, и государство оказывается неспособным их защитить. Также группой потенциальных жертв торговцев являются дети-сироты, живущие или вышедшие из детских домов, дети, попавшие к непорядочным усыновителям. Особую опасность представляет собой торговля несовершеннолетними с целью вовлечения их в проституцию. Одной из самых неизученных форм трафикинга является незаконное извлечение органов, клеток или тканей человека. В этой связи необходимо укрепление соответствующих процедур проверки работы компетентных органов на национальном уровне и межгосударственное сотрудничество. Рассчитываем, что после успешного проведения в ОБСЕ в 2020 году семинара, посвященного данной проблематике, процесс будет продолжен. В целом задачей государства является повышение качества расследований, внимательное отношение к каждой жертве, оказание ей помощи как медицинской, так и психологической, налаживание межведомственной координации, широкое использование современных технологий и экспертизы, совершенствование законодательства, направленного на защиту от преступных посягательств. И в заключении, важно учитывать, что в условиях укрепления трансграничных связей между группировками, которые координируют торговлю живым товаром, еще большую необходимость приобретает активное сотрудничество государств, межправительственных и неправительственных организаций. Только сообща можно добиться эффективных результатов в борьбе с торговлей людьми. Полный текст выступления мы распространим позднее. Благодарю вас за внимание.
Thank you. Allow me to intervene for just a moment to thank the interpreters for their excellent services today, as well as for the additional 10 minutes they have given us of their services this evening and release them for the day. We will continue for the last few interventions without interpretation. Thank you.
Thank you, Val. The next statement will be made by the delegation of Malta. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And in the interest of time, I will read a shortened version of our statement. At the outset, I would like to join others in thanking the OSCE Special Representative for the organization of this conference and the distinguished panelists for the fruitful and insightful presentation, as well as recommendations and best practices. We welcome the choice of this year's theme for the conference, which couldn't be timelier. As trafficking in persons continues to be a persistent challenge worldwide, further exacerbated by the war in Ukraine, the need for a victim-centered approach to combating this heinous crime has become more imperative than ever. With this in mind, Malta has been working intensively to step up its efforts, not only to combat trafficking in human beings, but also to ensure that victims acquire the necessary protection they need. In fact, a victim-centered and rights-based approach are the main pillars on which our national strategy will be based, with the aim of developing a sustainable system for early identification and comprehensive support for victims. Furthermore, the national strategy, which also seeks to ensure the provision of timely and effective protection and access to justice, as well as the provision of proper compensation for moral and material damages to victims in accordance with the law. Malta is also working on a more centralized and efficient national referral mechanism to bring together under one focal point all individual action plans of individual entities. Due to its complex and transnational nature, combating trafficking in human beings requires coordination not only at national level, but also at the regional and international levels. To this end, we strongly support the work of the Office of the Special Representative in offering its expertise and guidance to participating states towards the same. In that context, I would like to personally express my gratitude to Val Ritchie and his team for the recent technical visit to Malta to meet with national stakeholders to discuss ways to further enhance cooperation on this front. Our Maltese experts and interlocutors look forward to continue working with the Special Representative's Office on capacity building activities, including a potential national simulation exercise. I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. The next statement will be made by FAST, which is the Finance Against Slavery and Trafficking Initiative, already briefly mentioned by Liechtenstein. You have the floor.
Many thanks, Madam Moderator, OSCE and my esteemed colleagues in the room. My name is Dr. Leona Vaughan. I'm the Vulnerable Populations Lead with FAST, the Finance Against Slavery and Trafficking Initiative, which is housed at the UN University Centre for Policy Research. We mobilise the finance sector to identify, address and prevent slavery and trafficking, and we believe that this sector can play a significant role in protection and prevention. FAST set up the Survivor Inclusion Initiative in 2019 to increase financial access to basic banking services for survivors of slavery and trafficking. Bringing together 13 banks and over 500 survivor support organisations, it has seen over 2,000 bank accounts opened in the UK, Canada and the US, addressing issues such as survivors' lack of identity documents, lack of address or poor credit history, all of which are a result of their victimisation, along with institutions' concerns about compliance with anti-money laundering regulations through simplified due diligence. We are now undertaking studies of how this form of financial inclusion can offer protection to other populations vulnerable to exploitation, especially in the Global South. The current conflict in Ukraine has brought attention to the plight of refugees and their specific vulnerabilities, not only to complete destitution, but also, as we have heard today, to trafficking and slavery. FAST has been supporting banks and banking authorities in Europe to make explicit statements about implementing financial inclusion as protection for the 4.5 million people that we have seen flee Ukraine. Refugees can be provided with some level of protection against vulnerability to slavery and trafficking when their access to basic banking is provided for or maintained. This is to some extent enshrined within the Temporary Protection Directive, but it is acknowledged that limitations and challenges remain, particularly in relation to equal access to this form of protection by those most in need. FAST has always taken the position that financial inclusion and reintegration of victims, survivors, and people vulnerable to slavery offers safeguards against exploitation and re-exploitation. We believe that the financial access aspect of the response to the Ukraine crisis is an example of how states and the private sector can work together to synthesize and simplify policy, practice, and regulatory frameworks. And this can go a long way to protect the most vulnerable to slavery and trafficking. Lessons can be learned from the implementation of this response in order to improve protection of vulnerable people globally. Thank you.
Thank you. And finally, there is a request by the delegation of Georgia. I'm not sure whether from the room or online, but you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Allow me to begin my statement by strongly condemning Russia's ongoing full-scale military aggression against Ukraine, as well as reiterating Georgia's full support and solidarity with Ukraine. Russia's premeditated and unprovoked full-scale military aggression against Ukraine is a clear and blatant violation of fundamental principles and norms of the international law that resulted in enormous human suffering, deaths, and forced displacement of millions of Ukrainians. It poses a challenge to the security architecture. Millions of people, especially women and children fleeing from their homes, are at a higher risk of them being targeted by criminal networks. We should work closely to cooperate effectively responses to the current risks. Human trafficking is one of the most heinous crimes in the modern world, and the obligation to protect, assist, and provide redress to TIP victims is the core of the human rights-based approach, under which TIP is considered as a matter for human rights. We reaffirm our commitment that accurate identification, early intervention, and appropriate treatment of victims tailored to their individual needs is crucial. Georgian national referral mechanism and two different existing statuses of victim is a clear example of it. Georgia keeps providing the victims and statutory victims with state-run services and actively works for further strengthening its work. We continue to provide relevant staff working with victims with capacity building activities and modern guidelines by taking into consideration of the international standards and commitments. One of the important tools is the updated OSCE handbook on national referral mechanism. Last year, we simplified granting process of one-off state compensation for the victims. TIP victims can get the state compensation directly without referring to the court. This amendment also applies to those victims who were identified before this amendment. Witness and victims coordinators of the Ministry of Interior and Prosecutor's Office actively facilitate the victims and witnesses to participate in criminal proceedings, assist them to reduce the stress caused by the crime, prevents them from re-victimization, and assures the awareness during the court hearing stage. Despite COVID-19 pandemic, relevant agencies continue to fight against human trafficking. Remote services were implemented and a relevant protocol elaborated for professionals working with victims. Georgia also acknowledged the importance of effective coordination and cooperation among different stakeholders, both at national and international level, and keeps strong ties with partner organizations and states to properly address TIP-related consequences and harm. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. This concludes the list of requests for statements from the floor. Before you leave, at the end of the day, I would like to, first of all, thank the OSCE for organizing this conference and for involving also the Council of Europe as a partner. We are collaborating and complementing each other's international organizations, and this is obvious from the presentations and this first panel. And I would like to give back the floor now to Val Ricci, because he would like to make some announcements as regards tomorrow, I believe. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Petya, for your moderation of this panel. Thank you also to the great panelists who provided their interventions. A few notes. First of all, in 10 minutes, we have the first online side event organized by ODIHR on the inclusion of survivor voices. Tomorrow morning at 9:30, there's a side event on unconditional support and access to residents, organized by a number of civil society members, including Strada and LEFO, who were mentioned earlier, and the Council of Europe. And then 2 side events organized by my office, one at 11 on gender-sensitive approaches, which I already mentioned, and one at 12 on victims who are the most vulnerable and often overlooked victims. I encourage you to join that side event, as there's a very interesting and I think compelling panel of speakers. So thank you so much for your attention today. I hope you enjoy the side event program, and we look forward to seeing you all then tomorrow afternoon for panels 2 and 3. Thank you very much.